Says, "Have no fear, little flock." On Thursday morning, I asked the men in the Bible study, what are the messages of fear today? And there was this sort of great harumph. And somebody said, well, where do I start? And then I thought, well, where do we end? Some look out on a world of trouble, and they ask the question, how can there be a God? The Christian faith, however, asks a different kind of question. In other words, trouble is sort of a given in life. It always has been with us, it always will be. But rather, what does it mean to discover the promises of God even in the midst of trouble? When Jesus says, "Have no fear," He's not pretending that there is no trouble. He is not painting some kind of naive picture of life. Jesus is looking out at the same world that His disciples do. But where the disciples often react in fear, afraid to get out of the boat in a stormy sea, afraid to stand with a woman at the foot of the cross, responding with uncertainty in the face of the challenges of too many people, not enough food, too much illness, not enough wherewithal. And yet Jesus faces those same situations and He says, "Have no fear." And you might wonder, well, where does this courage for living come from? Where does this confidence to respond in a way come from? What does it mean for us to live with a sense of hope and not fear? Jesus does that by linking it with a promise. He says, "It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And we might ask, well, what is this kingdom? Is it a place? Is it a power? Is it a thing? How do we understand what it is? It's interesting that Jesus talks about the kingdom more than anything else. And yet He never gives a simple definition. But rather He tells stories that describe how we experience it and how we receive it. You know, a story like the prodigal son. A story about how God's kingdom is one in which God forgives and welcomes. Or the story about the workers in the vineyard. You know, the one where whether you worked 1 hour or the whole day, everyone gets paid the same wage. And we're told in that way that the nature of God's grace isn't really about pay to play. Nor is it about where we receive God's goodness on the basis of how good we are. But rather it's a measure of how good God is. We understand this appeal of grace in our minds. But it's another thing for the nature of God's grace and promise to push out or push away our fears or our instinctive reactions in life. And that's what Jesus is going after today. He's going after those instincts and those habits of living and for survival, poking at the worries and uncertainties that so often we live with. We may say that we believe in God and that we are followers of Jesus, but what we say and how we act may not be in sync. Martin Luther, when he was talking about the nature of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, he asked the question, he says, well, what does it mean to have a God? And the answer was not so much about how we think, but what we do. He said, well, your God is the thing that you cling or hold on to when you are anxious or worried. When the chips are down, what do you reach for to float or survive? Now, it may be God's promises. But he's observed that, often, frankly, in my life or in the world that I see, he said, we often cling to earthly treasures. He observed how, for example, we often turn to something like money or possessions, and we cling to them as somehow that in that way we will be safe or secure. And our opinion of God is in some ways tied to that. When we have them, we have God. When we don't have them, when life is a struggle, we wonder whether there is a God, or we doubt His goodness. God, our opinion of God, becomes contingent, not on the promises of God, but on something else, these earthly treasures. It's not that we make an idol of money or possessions or even family or a good name or reputation. We don't make it directly. But in that sort of indirect way, it becomes a measure of what we truly believe in. Jesus put it this way. He says, where your treasure is, there is your heart. We could put it this way. Where your gut instinct is, there is your heart. Where your instinctive habits to reach out and grab onto, there is your heart. I've been reading a book with the title, You Are What You Love, and the subheading is, It May Not Be What You Think. We often think of religion, even of our Christian faith, as a matter of what we think. And we imagine that, the Christian faith is about a set of principles. God is the creator, Jesus died for my sins, the gift of the Holy Spirit. And if I believe in those things, then everything is taken care of. But what happens is that we even think, well, if I have those things, I really don't need to go to church because I understand what it's all about and I'm fine. But life is also a matter of our gut, our desire, the things we do each and every day, and how we act in the face of uncertainty or even our fears. Life is about those deeply ingrained habits. I think about the morning rituals that I do, and they make me wonder, because after I have read the paper and checked the stock market and sort of gotten plugged into the worries of the world, and I balance that over against whatever time I might spend in reading the Bible and devotion, frankly, folks, I feel convicted. Someone has observed that in these brief verses, what we have really, though, is a description of the Christian life. That following Jesus is not just simply a head thing, but it is about a spiritual change of our whole self. A change in what we desire, a change in how we look at life, a change in which we might tap into the wisdom and the freedom of the gospel. And how does this passage describe that change? Well, one, simply to say, to live without fear. That is, when I tie my life to the narrative of God's kingdom, it changes how I look at things. It is to recognize that this earthly treasure that we have is not everything. And that when we have the ability to give away our earthly goods, when we can learn to live with a sense of generosity towards others, it's more than just simply being a nice person. But it's about staking a claim in God. And then 3, we have this parable of sort of living with anticipation. Jesus tells this story. He says, be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet. And what does it mean to be ready? You think about what the actors in the story actually do. They just keep on doing what they've been asked to do. Some are sweeping the floor. Others are checking the door to see who's at the gate. Others are simply taking care of the kids. They're just simply doing what they are being asked to do. But they do that with the anticipation that the master will return, and there will come a time when those tasks are done. And here's where the story gets, frankly, strange. For when the master comes, Jesus says, he will fasten his belt, and he will have the servants sit down to eat, and the master will serve them. Here, have some cake. Have you ever thought, what does it mean for God to serve you? We tend to think about how our life is meant to be serving God. Go in peace and serve the Lord. But the story doesn't end that way. Rather, it ends with the Lord taking delight in serving us. It's like the end of the reading takes us way back to the first words we heard. Have no fear, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you. So what does it mean to live our life? Not in the anticipation that God is an angry judge, but that our life moves towards this conclusion where we are gathered into the delight of God who comes to serve. And how does that anticipation change how we live? This past week, I visited someone in the hospital who had a heart procedure that did not turn out well. It didn't work. And when we visited, there were many reasons to fear about what would come next. And all the old certainties of health and being able to take care of life and matters, everything was now sort of put on the table. And there was a recognition that the future was going to be far different than what had been the past or even recent. And yet our conversation was not so much a dwelling on the uncertainty and fear as it was naming the promises of God and the gospel and the treasures that come from heaven, and how those treasures give us a different perspective when our life is upset. Then later that day, I stopped by one of the dear members of this congregation, John Wasson. Last year, when John was 79, he was the healthiest 79-year-old in this bunch here. But cancer of the liver changes things quickly and dramatically. And yet in all the visits I've had with John, he has always been one to say, "Pastor, the Lord will see us through." Each of those visits was a test of what Jesus said, "Have no fear, little flock." Each visit was a recognition that there come those moments when there is no more time to prepare for the Master. Each visit revealed how trusting in the treasures of heaven, it is not a last-minute cram session, but it comes from a life shaped and formed by practices of the gospel. Each visit was a chance to see that what we do here in worship, what we do as a community of faith when we gather, it is about soul training, informed by the gospel. It's something that we enter into and do together. Think about this is really what church is all about. This is why Luther talked about baptism as not just simply a one-time thing, but rather a lifelong journey of remembrance and formation. It is in worship that in our life together as the body of Christ, we practice these ways of living into the promise of the gospel and of Jesus. We gather for our hearts to be formed by the gospel, fears to be tempered by God's good pleasure, desires to be changed so that our grasp on earthly treasures is loosened and our hold on those eternal treasures are strengthened. In our gathering as a people, we learn what it means to say, "I'm sorry," and to receive a promise of forgiveness. We practice how to pray for peace, to pray for others, but I think above all, to pray to receive the kingdom and God's good pleasure. We rehearse the freedom we have in Jesus and not fear. In the gospel, we practice a larger meaning, where truth is measured not by what I have kept, but by what I have given away and trusted. I think about how God has placed First Lutheran here in the heart of the city. It is to shine a light on these lasting treasures of the gospel, to bear witness to a life that is greater than our fears, to point to the good pleasure of God, to be a sign of God's kingdom that even now shows up in surprising ways. Amen.